Welcome, folks. We made it to the last day of class.
Here.
Yeah, it's a time for celebration. We're almost to summer break. We do have a couple of special guests with us today. Some of my graduate students. They finished their final class earlier this morning, and they were so broken up about it. I mean, tears streaming down their face that I said, look, if you guys want to come to one more class, you can come to my undergraduate audit class later today. So they were really excited about that. So please give them your old warm applause. You guys are welcome here. I don't have any classes after this one, so you're really gonna make me on this one.
We're really gonna be crying after this.
That's right. That's right. The tears will be streaming. Speaking of additional classes, we don't have any more class section of lectures, but we do have a final exam. And by the way, I would like to make sure that everybody is clear on the terminology here. This is not an opportunity to, this is not, you don't get to say, Dr. Barnes isn't having a final exam. That is patently not true, okay? I am absolutely having a final exam for this class, all right? Now, whether or not you choose to take that final exam is contingent on your personal choice, but there will absolutely be an opportunity to take the final exam. Now, why is that important? Because if you go running to the provost and say, Dr. Barnes is skipping final exams, I get in a lot of trouble, all right? My head is on the line because of your attestation, so be very, very careful about how you approach that. You may say, oh, well, what can Dr. Barnes do to harm me? It's like, just don't pretend. If I find out about it, it will come back to haunt you. I promise you that. I'm a nice person until I get hurt, then I'm a vengeful person. So, all joking aside, if you are planning on opting out of the final exam, I want to remind you that you do have to submit your summary write-ups. I'm suspecting most of you will do that immediately after class today. If you don't do it immediately after class today, don't let it wait. Do it as soon as you possibly can. It is very easy to forget about. How do I know this? Because maybe I've experienced this in the past. So if you do not submit your write-ups by Sunday afternoon, I'm going to check them probably around Sunday around noon, and I'll say, are you planning to take a final exam? And that'll probably be, no, I'll get this write-ups submitted. That's my expectation in that comment. If I don't hear anything back and on Monday at noon, I've not heard anything back, I'm going to assume that you're planning on taking the final exam. All right, so. Please make sure you get those taken care of as soon as possible, if not sooner. That's my fault. All right. If there are any other questions or concerns about the way things are going, like I've posted a lot of information, a lot of details, you always are welcome to shoot me an email or stop by my office and ask me questions. But everything should be wrapping up to a pretty tidy conclusion. However, we have one more presentation to do. All right. Did we save the best for last, guys? Is that we're moving on? Okay. All right. All right. So 5 of my favorite letters, PCOB. Let's talk about it. All right.
Yeah. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Max. This is Drew, Luca, and Aiden, and we're going to be presenting over the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. So here's a brief overview of what we're going to be covering. So starting with the intro, I'll be overviewing what the PCAOB exactly is. Looking at their mission statement on their website, we can see the PCAOB regulates the audits of public companies and SEC registered brokers and dealers in order to protect investors, further the public interest in the preparation of information, accurate and independent audit reports. They have 4 main responsibilities that the PCAOB is responsible for. The first one is registering public accounting firms. So this is making sure that all firms that perform audits of public companies are registered and have all the proper compliance. Next, they have to create standards for auditing, ethics, and independence. And then they also inspect accounting firms for compliance, make sure that all accounting firms follow the standards that they create, and they enforce these standards for firms that are not following the rules. Looking at their vision and values, we can see their vision statement here, again, taken directly from their website. The PCAOB will be a trusted leader that promotes quality auditing through forward-looking, responsive, and innovative oversight. At all times, we will act in accordance with our values. We will perform our work with integrity, pursue excellence, operate with effectiveness, embrace collaboration, inclusiveness, and respect, and demand accountability. So listed there were their 5 main values. I'll dive a little bit deeper into all of those. The first one is integrity. This is adhering to the highest standard of ethical and professional conduct. Next is excellence, and it's striving to be the very best you can be, as well as developing all the talent that work within the PCOB to have the highest level of knowledge that they are able to have. Effectiveness is implementing change in a timely manner. Collaboration is working together within the PCOB, within all the audit firms to make sure everyone has honest and open communication. And last is accountability. This is holding all auditors accountable for the work that they've done. The four main purposes of the PCAOB, the first one being to protect investors and shareholders from losing their money, making sure that the company that they invest in have honest financial statements, no obvious misstatements. Again, another purpose of the PCAOB is to improve the quality of the audit, making sure that all information is accurate and timely. And then they have to enhance the trust in U.S. capital markets, make sure that investors are comfortable investing their money into these companies. And lastly, they have to ensure auditors comply with professional and standard legal requirements. Like I said earlier, they create the ethical and independence requirements for accounting firms, and they must make sure that all firms follow these.
Yeah, now moving on to the background on what led to the creation of the PCOB. Kind of starts with the failure of self-regulation. We've kind of heard this in previous classes like AS and especially this one, but we heard about them for examples of Enron and WorldCom. So in 2001, Enron was exposed for using special purpose entries, billions, and inflate their earnings. And then similarly, in the following year, WorldCom auditors uncovered fraudulently capitalized expenses that were used to inflate their net income. So this resulted in $67 billion of loss in shareholder value and $2 billion of employee retirement assets due to airline failures. And then also 180 billion losses of WorldCom investors. So this event really just led to the loss of public trust and the realize that self-regulation isn't going to work anymore. So what resulted of that was Congress addressed the issue and it passed the SOX Act due to, again, the WorldCom and Enron failures. They realized there needs to be a new standard in the regulation itself. So they passed that and they did that by forming the PCOB itself. PCOB is a body that is requiring the overseeing of auditors to create these new standards. So what is the structure of the PCOB itself? It is a 5-member board that includes the chairman. That functions as a quasi-governmental body. These members are appointed in 5-year increments and staggered, so there isn't any overlap. They are appointed by consulting with the SEC, the chair of the Federal Reserve System, and the Secretary of Treasury. The board can be only composed of a maximum of 2 CPAs at a time, and if that's one of the CPAs is the chairman themselves, the requirement is they can't have practiced the last 5 years before being appointed to the role. Like I said before, the SEC is really involved, and really they're the ones overseeing the PCOB and have the power to remove members and appoint them themselves. Oh, I forgot funding. I don't have to go back. Sorry. So how's it funded? So the PCOB isn't, normally it's a not-for-profit, so it gets its funding in a unique way. It does this by getting fees that are paid through public companies that are using audit firms as information, so there can also be broker dealers that are also using these informations to make their statements, and basically it's structured this way to build this independence from the firm, so there's no independence violations of that sort. So now going to how this really impacted auditing, kind of the main themes that really ended the self-regulation itself. It really increased transparency and accountability in the field and improved these independence rules like I was getting at. And then it really enhanced the audit quality and then really restored that investor confidence.
Now moving on to our current status of the PCAOB. So recently they just adopted 2 new standards. One being one of their most impactful updates is the QC 1000. This requires firms to implement a risk-based quality control system and not rely on year-end inspections. It also mandates like a proactive identification system for risk and design controls. And it also introduces new policies where existing auditors will have to make new training requirements, and it kind of shifts their day-to-day responsibilities. Their second standard that they've adopted is the AS 2901. This replaces the prior confirmation omitted procedures after the report date guidelines. But this also provides a clearer framework for evaluating insufficient audit evidence discovered post-issuance. And it's a very meaningful PCAOB update. Just reinforces the related AS 1215 promising faster documentation completion. They've also got some new leaders. So they swore in some new chairs as of this recent February. Demetrius Jim Logothetis was appointed to the lead as a chairman of the PCAOB, and he's that guy on the bottom. And then on our left, top left, we got Dr. Mark A. Calabria, and then on our right, we have Stephen D. Lawton. They were both sworn in as board members. Now, moving on to some advisory groups. These are two groups already have existed in the past in the PCAOB. However, they've appointed some new members as of now. So I'd just like to hit that for a second. They just appointed 9 new members as of this year with terms that will expire in 2027. And then they have 7 continuing members that will be there for the rest of this year. So 16 total in the investor advisory group. And then standards and emerging issues advisory group. They just got sworn in 12 new members with terms also expiring in 2027, and then 12 other members that will be continuing there, and their terms will end in 2026. So 24 total members. Then kind of some interesting things that I found recently. PCAOB had a sanction on a small CPA firm in Michigan called Zwick CPA PLLC. So Jack Zwick, the engagement leader at the CPA firm, had multiple violations, including their audit manager that works for Genie Energy, also violated a ton of standards. The firm and Zwick missed risk of a material misstatement, so they didn't identify it properly and didn't assess it at all. They also provided complete insufficient evidence of control testing for their financial reporting. And then they also had a breach of existence occurrence. They basically had a ton of revenue with no sales to back it up. Just a ton of fake revenue. And then overall, just really poor team supervision. And then Hoskow, their audit manager, tampered with predecessor work papers, changing the names and the dates and the sign-offs. And then he also created false irrelevant documentation for Genie's operations, which, like I said, was the company he was working for. So as a result of this, Zwick and the firm got their registration revoked, and they also owe a $50,000 penalty. And then Zwick and Hoskow themselves are required to have 40 hours of professional training, and they are required to also have board consent for the next time they want membership for a future firm. And then here's their LinkedIn I found, and they don't really have a lot of followers or employees, so make sure to give them a follow. They kind of need it right now, but I don't think Zwick will be doing much auditing left because he started his career apparently in like 1958, so he's pretty old. So I think that it's pretty much it for him.
So now to look into some of the future considerations regarding the PCAOB. And so to start, a lot of people outside and inside of the PCAOB have been calling for a modernization of some of their audit standards. So these standards were inherited from the AICPA and are overall pretty out of date. They really need to update them to reflect the current business environment that involves complex valuations and operates on a global scale. So some standards specifically that are very out of date are their standards relating to risk assessment. Their current standards on risk assessment have no mention of data analytics or any current technological systems. So they need to work on getting those updated to provide proper guidance there. Their audit evidence standards are also not particularly updated. They're operating under these standards, they're operating that all audit evidence is physical documentation, when, as we know now, most of it is actually online. And then finally, for controls testing, a lot of companies now operate with IT systems and IT controls, and the PCAOB does not have specific standards on how to deal with this. And then a fun quote that I found from the PCAOB chair in 2024 is that our standards do not specifically address the performance of technology-assisted analysis. And considering that most audits are done with technology now, I'd probably say all of them are. That is not a good look. And then so for another important thing that the PCAOB is considering is how to regulate AI and technology to protect investors. So some of their focus areas are how AI is used. Their goals are to they want firms to use it to make audits more efficient. But on the flip side, they also want to make sure that they're protecting client information. Cryptocurrency is something unique that they've been looking into, specifically how to value it since its value changes so quickly, and also where it belongs on a balance sheet since its value changes so quickly, it offers a lot of unique challenges there. And then their overall goals relating to AI and technology is enhancing audit quality and not undermining it. And by doing this, they'll continue to protect investors even as the audits become more complex. And so in early 2025, the House of Representatives actually passed a bill as a part of a certain version of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. They passed it through the House that the SEC would absorb the PCAOB. And the goals behind this were to cut costs and reduce redundancies between the SEC and the PCAOB. This did fail in the Senate. They did not get enough votes to pass it through the Senate because they argued that it violated the Byrd Rule. Because as we mentioned earlier, the PCAOB is publicly funded. And so the people in the country get the benefits of the board without it being funded by the government. So if it were to fall under the SEC, then the government would be taking on unnecessary expenses for the exact same benefit. And so for that reason, it did not pass through the Senate. But it does offer some interesting questions about the future of the PCAOB because they got pretty close to eliminating it and to rolling it up into the SEC. So if they're able to find some way to get around that Byrd Rule, it is possible and something that should be considered for the future. And another challenge the PCAOB has been facing is global oversight. There are a lot of firms that operate all across the globe and a lot of US-based firms that rely on foreign audit firms and foreign audit information. And so a big question about the PCAOB is should they and do they have the power to regulate and inspect these foreign firms? So to kind of hit both sides of this argument, if the goal of the PCAOB is to protect US investors, then arguably they should be able to regulate and inspect these foreign firms that are providing information on US companies to US investors. But on the other side, the PCAOB exists in the United States. So why in the world would they have the right to regulate an audit firm operating in Europe? And so it's an interesting future consideration that the PCAOB is going to have to find some way to work around. And then finally, the last thing that they're considering for the future is audit reports and how to keep them as transparent as possible while also limiting the complexity. As you can see here, I clipped the audit report that we had in class, the standard unqualified one. And so what we discovered is that critical audit matters are actually a newer part of the audit report. And a lot of people have been considering whether or not they actually provide useful information to investors. And so it is something the PCAOB is considering is whether or not they make audit reports and financial statements more complex or whether they provide valuable information. And so the audit reports are currently very complex, but they provide a lot of important information to investors. So again, it's about the trade-off of making sure they have the information needed without confusing everybody. And then along similar lines with the disclosures, a lot of people would argue that disclosures are extremely helpful because they provide valuable, like written information outside of the numbers in the financial statements about the financial position of the company. But again, where is the line where there are too many disclosures where it doesn't become helpful anymore and it just overcomplicates the report?
All right. In conclusion, here's a handful of key takeaways we can learn about the PCAOB. First, they are vital to the trust and ensure audit quality and investor protection in all public markets. They're vital for all investors that they know where their money is going and that these companies are being honest and the firms that audit them are independent. Next, it's a direct result of a need for strong accounting oversight as a result of what Aiden touched on earlier with Enron and WorldCom, all these scandals that happened in the early 2000s. There was a real lack of oversight. So the PCAOB was created to monitor all auditing firms. And then it's still a relatively new organization, only being around for the past 25 or so years. So it's adapting to a lot of the new business environment issues, kind of like Drew touched on how AI and auditing is going to work, crypto, how that's going to be valued in the financial statements, as well as globalization. Our audit firms in foreign countries allowed to audit US companies, how that all works. And then it really remains essential to US capital market trust. Shareholders want to know that their money is going in a safe place, and these companies are not going to be fraudulent with their financial reports.
Thank you. Do you guys have any questions?
With applause, there must be no questions. Oh, you guys know me. I'll always have questions. So let's just start off the festivities by asking a very complex and deep technical question. So would you say that a researcher who's got published research in the field of PCAOB is somebody that deserves your respect and admiration? I just want to make sure. Sure, just getting that out there. How is the PCA different from the SEC?
So the PCAOB offers more of the standards on how things are done, I believe, and then the SEC is more of the enforcement of these standards and also on I argue more on how the financial statements are built and made, and the PCAOB is more on the audit side.
Now, I believe it was Luca actually referred to something that we talked a little bit about in class about the change in the timeliness of documentation archiving, because it used to be 45 days and it was recently changed about a year ago to 15 days for archiving. Why do you think that there's such an emphasis on the timeliness of gathering and preparing documentation for storage? Why do you think that's was such a point of emphasis for them?
At least for me, I feel like if you're using that information, it's less of a project reports to or project statement come out to justify why your statements look the way they do.
All right, Drew, you touched on a point about, and this doesn't have to be answered by Drew, but I was just pointing out that Drew made the point. You touched on a point that investors may or may not find critical audit matters useful. Former SEC Chair Jay Clayton actually said that he did not want, when this is when CAMs were being introduced, he did not want them to be boilerplate, which boilerplate is just fancy vernacular for not using the same language over and over again. And one of the big reasons why people have said that this information is not useful is because it actually is boilerplate, that auditors use the exact same language over and over again. So do you think that there may be, that CAMs may actually find more usefulness if auditors were to use a little bit more plain language rather than kind of legally enforced language?
I think for sure. I think that people are much more likely to read and understand things that they can, well, read and find useful things that they can actually understand without having to put a whole lot of work into there. I think that the technical nature of them can lead to people just skimming over it or just assuming that they're not important because they don't want to sit down and take the time to understand what's written there.
So if that's the case, why do we think that auditors are using consistent, tedious language over and over again? And more to the point, why is it Professor Templeton's fault?
I would say it probably has something to do with legal compliance, making sure that everything is worded in a way that it complies with all the laws and regulations of the audit report.
Something that you alluded to, is that had to do with the lack of technological focus on within the standards. And I would agree that that's a problem, but I want to recall something that I heard this morning. I actually heard a presentation from a group. It was about technology and the future of auditing. It's actually a very good presentation. It's really well done. If you want the recording, I can share it with you. But one of the things that we discussed in the question and answer session afterwards is we talked about whether or not it was going to be feasible for audits to actually be able to operate at every single possible level they can operate, because they're going to be operating at small business level, but they're going to be operating at like quantum computing organizational levels, and the disparity between size of organizations and their responsibilities and their needs is just going to be all over the place. You can't really customize. You can't really have a template that you can customize to different situations because the circumstances are going to be so different. Is there an argument for saying that the reason that they leave the standards so deliberately vague and obtuse is because they're trying to make them so that they can be utilized in a variety of situations rather than have to provide specific guidance for every single possible outcome?
I think that makes a lot of sense. I hadn't considered them before being intentionally vague. I think I looked at it more through the lens of being outdated instead of intentionally, leaving room for interpretation. But I think that would be, it's an interesting way to think about it because it does offer everybody the ability to get involved regardless of the size of the client and the firm. But I also would argue that what they have now is probably too vague, and that maybe they don't need to have standards and requirements for every single situation, but maybe updating them to still be vague while still also mentioning the standards that should go into place involving this technology. think that that would make a lot of sense.
So related to that, you showed some images of some of the people who are recently on the PCOB, and they share a common characteristic with a lot of the PCOB past members. And I don't know a less blunt way to say this, but they're all old white men.
Yep.
And this is kind of a common theme with audit or with accounting firms, is that they're headed by people who are generationally absent. They basically are several generations ahead. And I say that as somebody who's the prime age to be a partner in an auditing firm. So is it possible that there's that gap that exists in the PCOB simply because the people who are at the PCOB are not as connected with what the real world looks like anymore?
Yeah, I definitely think you can make that argument. Like you said, that generational gap, they're not seeing how it's operating now day to day and how they're supposed to be considering that when it comes to the standards for vehicle.
What's the solution for that problem? Because obviously we want to have people who've got expertise and knowledge in that area, but we also don't want people setting standards who have no idea the way that things actually work. Doesn't have to be a specific solution, but just kind of guidance in that area.
I think it's just a willingness to be flexible and expand to different areas that they haven't been able to before. Because I feel like everything's pretty set in place, and kind of there's not much room. They don't really leave much room for expansion. So I feel like if they kind of have that flexibility to maybe change a couple things in a good light, that it might kind of fix some of those issues.
Other questions? Any from our PCOB experts? Sorry.
Just check. Did you guys say that you had to not be practicing for 5 years before you became a member of the board?
It was, when I looked up, it was just the chairman. The
Oh,
board
okay.
members themselves are fine, but the restriction to not be present prior to 5 years is the chairman.
Do you think that might have some effect on like why they're so slow to get up with technology? It's because they are people that haven't been in the profession for the past 5 years with all that developing?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, like Dr. Bunch was saying, there to see what all the stuff we're implementing nowadays in our practice. So, I mean, I really agree with that. They're not seeing the changes we're making.
Questions? All right, well done, guys. Well, that wraps it up. I will try to keep it short, but thank you very much for a good semester. I really enjoyed this semester class. I've had varying experiences. And I'm not just saying that to flatter you because your evaluation's already published. But I really did enjoy this class. A lot of liveliness, a lot of discussion, a lot of activity. For those of you who are going on to bigger and better things from here, I wish you the best of luck. For those of you going on to the MAC program, then you will definitely.
Yeah.